Welcome to Conference Highlights, recorded in front of a live audience at an evidence-based perioperative medicine, that's EBPOM conference. EBPOM are world leaders in perioperative education, so why not join us at our next meeting with a special discount for Top Med Talk subscribers. Look us up on www.ebpom, that's EBPOM.com. Top Med Talk. So some potential conflicts of interest. I'm not going to bring any conflicts to bear. We all learnt about this in medical school, the distribution or movement of water through the various different compartments controlled by forces such as osmotic and oncotic forces and sodium-potassium pumps. We know most of the fluids in the cells. The next biggest compartment is the interstitium. Then there's the intravascular bit of it, and 2/3 of that is plasma. We also had diagrams like this showing the distribution of water through the various compartments, and the idea that if you give 5% glucose-free water, it distributes itself through the whole 45-litre bucket. If you give an isotonic crystalloid, it's in a 15-litre bucket. If you give a colloid, it's in a 5-litre bucket. Wouldn't it be great if life was like that? Colloids, albumin, dextrans, gelatins, the starches. Now, albumin at one stage was poison for a while. It killed every sixth person that touched it, but that passed. Dextrans have been abandoned in many places. Gelatins only really got traction in certain parts of the world, so never approved by the FDA. And at one stage, certainly the start of the Great World Fluid debate, the poster children were the starches, going from the hetas to the pentas to the quadras, and then through the different electrolyte combinations. Cost has always been probably the biggest debate in the colloid crystalloid debate. This is from NICE Guidance 174, looking at the use of intravenous fluids in the United Kingdom. The cost of 2 litres of each fluid, £1.40 when it was published, for 2 litres of saline, so 70 pence a litre. Hartmann's slightly more expensive, 4.5% human albumin in the UK, 100 times more expensive. So that's why people actually are often really debating the cost of these things. There are some debates that have come to bear about safety and efficacy. We know the textbook explanation, that if you put a crystalloid in the intravascular space, it leaks beyond the vascular endothelium, and therefore it is edemogenic by definition, expanding both spaces. And we had a 2-day roundtable with alleged world experts recently. You can listen to some of it on Top Med Talk, and apparently that remains true. So even in some of the critical care trials, you do end up giving not 3 or 4 or 5 times as much crystalloid, but about 1.5 to 2 times as much to achieve the same effect. So that remains the truth about the argument. Colloids, the idea was albumin-like, perhaps superalbumin, put them in the intravascular space, they stay there, they only expand that. Wouldn't that be lovely if that's what really happened? Now along come the big critical care trials, really spurned on by the albumin versus saline trials, suggesting that there was no difference in outcome. 7,000 patients, Australia and New Zealand, with subsets suggesting that perhaps there were differences. So more mortality in blunt trauma with head injuries, for example, if you received albumin. So albumin potentially associated with worse outcome, but no clear advantage of the colloid versus the crystalloid. Then other trials switching over to look at the starches, suggesting that actually outcome worse in starches and critical illness, in particular an impact on acute kidney injury. Now if you look at the literature around that time that resulted in people getting very excited about starches being potentially dangerous, the 3 major meta-analyses are starch severe sepsis, starch critically ill, starch severe sepsis. The other thing that comes along is the Glycocalyx, so challenging Starling's original forces based on the discovery in the last decade or so of a peptidoglycan lining of the vessels that traps the albumin or other colloid molecules and actually forms this gelatinous layer. So it's where the colloids or the albumin lives and produces this difference between the inside and outside spaces. That all seems to make sense. But in sepsis or blunt trauma or following induction of anaesthesia or getting a bad cold or surgeon putting knife to skin, it gets damaged and goes down. It's not fatal. It just means that the transcapillary escape rates are now different and colloids are now much less likely to work like colloids. Everything that comes along as recognised is in healthy volunteers, a colloid behaves like a textbook colloid. If you take off, bleed, a litre of blood, for example, and then you replace it with a litre of colloid, you need 3 to 5 times as much crystalloid to do the same job, providing you're treating central hypovolemia. So a colloid seems to behave like a colloid if your vascular endothelium is intact, if your glycocalyx is intact, and if you're truly hypovolemic. Looking at the relevance of the harm signal in critical illness in the context of elective major surgery, where certainly most of our experience, we'd abandoned colloids, starches in particular, in the critically ill patient decades ago. We were using it predominantly in elective major surgery. When we looked closely at the literature that was available there, we could find no suggestion of harm, possible benefit with colloids, but our conclusion was that those small trials, narrow confidence intervals, it's probably right, but given the absence of demonstrable benefit, we were unable to recommend the use of starch in surgical patients. Now, interesting reaction, my starch-hating friends rang me up and said, well done, you've seen the light, we've told you. My starch-loving friends said, what have you done? You've left the side down. You just said that it looked like there was a possible benefit there. And I said, well, that's just an evidence-based recommendation. Given the absence of demonstrable benefit, we're unable to recommend the use of Hess, or albumin, or gelatin, or saline, or Hartmann's, or blood, or FFP, or anything else you might choose to give somebody. What you can say definitively, until possibly relatively recently, is we definitely don't know. But we definitely don't know with a high level of confidence. There is possible evidence of harm with Hess, albumin, gelatin, saline, Hartmann's. There was a time where people said, you're not telling me you could hurt people with saline. And now it appears as though you can. That's the current state of the art, that you can hurt people with it, and all those other things. So then the argument was about the A versus B, its dosing timing, is if you look at the goal-directed trials, this meta-analysis led by Mike Grocott, it seems to be that the timing, quantity, accurate delivery of fluid does seem to be associated with a slightly better or significantly better outcome. And one of the tantalising things was almost all those trials, including the recent ones I've shown you in Press, Fedora, were done with colloids. So what Andrea Kurtz was going to present to us was the results, we hoped, of the first large multi-centre, there has been a single-centre trial, of goal-directed fluid therapy where they changed in the two groups, colloid in one group, so cardiac output monitored goal-directed, crystalloid in the other group. Now, I don't think Andrea deliberately broke her arm to try and avoid presenting the results here, but I think it's going to get published in a famous major journal, and you'll see the results of that trial coming out in a meeting, possibly in the United States of America, possibly in San Francisco. I couldn't possibly comment later this year. But some of us have seen the results presented, and from what we saw, it didn't look to me as though there was a significant difference between the two groups. So let's wait to see those results, but same as the smaller single-centre trial, despite me believing there was clearly going to be a difference, didn't look to me as though there was a difference. There also seemed to be no hint, with giving larger quantities of hydroxyethyl starch in one limb, of any of the alleged harms that might be associated, but people say it's too small to judge that. The last thing I'll leave with you is, if we can keep these debates alive, published very recently, is this closed-loop system for delivering colloids versus crystalloids. So if you take the human beings out of it, it would appear, and let the computer help to say when to give the colloid versus the crystalloids, there were differences in the quantities of fluids given, small trial, but tantalising, and there were differences, possibly, very small, in meaningful, clinically important outcomes. So have a look at this. It might be that the colloid is a precision tool, and it might be, if you use it very, very carefully, with the help of a machine, or a very, very particular practitioner, that you get a difference in outcome. So I stand on the side of the fact, as I've said, I think from the beginning of this debate, is we still definitely don't know when choosing between a colloid and a crystalloid. Some people will tell me you should use crystalloids because they're cheaper. Is that the only reason you can give for it? That's me finished. Thank you.
Thanks for downloading and listening to Top Med Talk. Don't forget to find us on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, even got our own YouTube channel. Whichever your favourite social media feed is, we're bound to be there. Find us. Also, subscribe to this podcast so that you never miss an episode. And make sure you go to the Top Med Talk website, topmedtalk.com, and get on board with the email updates. Oh, whilst you're at it as well, I suggest you download our entire back catalogue. We're categorising at the moment. We're having a little look through it. It may not always be in the form that you currently find it. So if you get your hard drive ready for a full-on download via the website perhaps, or perhaps through your podcatcher. Oh, and while you're online, check out ebpom.org/meetings. While you're there, get excited about EBPOM London 2019, the London Perioperative Medicine Congress. It's on July the 2nd, and it's one of many meetings that EBPOM organises around the world in order to communicate the perioperative medicine message. Have a look, ebpom.org/meetings.